I never belonged in places like Blackwood Estate. The moment I stepped through those towering iron gates, I could feel it in my bones. The perfectly manicured lawns, the marble fountains, the way even the air seemed richer somehow. Everything about this place screamed money, prestige, and a world I had no business being part of. I was just Emma Collins from Riverside Apartments, the girl who worked 3 jobs to make ends meet, who bought her clothes from thrift stores and counted every dollar twice. But sometimes life has a funny way of putting you exactly where you need to be, even when it feels like the last place on earth you belong. What I discovered within those estate walls would change everything I thought I knew about myself, about my past, and about where I truly belonged in this world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning I first walked up that endless cobblestone driveway to Blackwood Estate, my hands were shaking. Not from the cold October air that swept across Millbrook Valley, but from pure nerves. I had landed this job through a temp agency, and honestly, I needed it desperately. My rent was 2 weeks overdue, my car was making that grinding noise again, and my bank account had exactly $47 to last me until whenever this gig ended. The agency had been vague about the details. Temporary administrative assistant for a private estate. Good pay, immediate start. I didn't ask too many questions because I couldn't afford to be picky. The estate loomed ahead of me like something out of a movie. The main house was this massive stone structure, with tall windows that caught the morning light and threw it back like diamonds. Gardens stretched out on either side, perfectly trimmed hedges forming intricate patterns that probably cost more to maintain than I made in a year. I could see staff members in crisp uniforms moving purposefully across the grounds, each one looking like they belonged there in a way I absolutely did not. I had worn my best outfit, which wasn't saying much, a black skirt I'd bought at a discount store, a white blouse that I'd ironed 3 times to get the wrinkles out, and shoes that pinched my feet but looked professional enough. Still, walking up those steps to the massive front door, I felt like a fraud. Like any moment someone would realize I didn't belong and escort me right back out those gates. Mrs. Helen Torres answered the door, and her first look at me told me everything I needed to know. Her dark eyes swept over me from head to toe, taking in every detail with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades sizing people up in seconds. She was impeccably dressed in a navy suit, her silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that made you want to stand up straighter just being near her. "Miss Collins, I presume," she said, her voice crisp and professional. There was no warmth in it, but there wasn't outright hostility either. Just the neutral tone of someone evaluating whether you were worth their time. "Yes, ma'am." From the Millbrook Temp Agency. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the slight tremor in it. Mrs. Torres definitely heard it too. She stepped aside to let me in, and I found myself standing in a foyer that was bigger than my entire apartment. The ceiling stretched up 2 stories, with a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than my car. The marble floor was so polished I could see my reflection in it, and oil paintings in heavy gold frames lined the walls. Everything was perfect, pristine, and expensive. "Mr. Blackwood is in his study. He'll want to meet you before we discuss your duties." She turned and began walking down a hallway, lined with more paintings and antique furniture. Her heels clicked against the marble in a steady rhythm that I tried to match with my own footsteps, though mine sounded somehow cheaper, less confident. As we walked, I caught glimpses of other rooms through open doorways. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a dining room with a table that could seat 20 people, a sitting room with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Each room made me feel smaller, more out of place. This wasn't just wealth. This was generational money, the kind that built legacies and owned pieces of history. Mrs. Torres knocked on a heavy wooden door at the end of the hallway. A deep voice called out for us to enter, and she pushed the door open, gesturing for me to go first. The study was warm and masculine, with dark wood paneling and leather-bound books lining the walls. A massive desk dominated the room, and behind it sat a man who could only be Richard Blackwood. He was probably in his mid-60s, with silver hair that was perfectly styled and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore an expensive-looking sweater over a collared shirt, and even sitting down, he had the kind of presence that filled a room. When he stood to greet me, I noticed he was tall and still carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. "Miss Collins," he said, extending his hand. His handshake was firm, and his eyes held mine for just a moment longer than necessary. Something flickered across his expression, so brief I almost missed it. Surprise, maybe? Or recognition. But that was impossible. I had never met this man before in my life. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Blackwood," I managed to say, trying to project more confidence than I felt. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and I sat down carefully, conscious of every movement. Mrs. Torres remained standing near the door, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the interaction with sharp attention. "Mrs. Torres tells me you come highly recommended from the agency," Mr. Blackwood said, settling back into his chair. "Though I have to admit, I don't typically hire temporary staff for my personal affairs." I felt my heart skip. Was he already having second thoughts? "I understand, sir. I'm very reliable, and I learn quickly. Whatever you need done, I'll make sure it gets handled properly." He studied me for a moment longer, that same strange expression crossing his features. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Collins. Where are you from originally?" The question seemed odd for a temp job interview, but I answered anyway. "I grew up here in Millbrook, sir, born and raised. My mother passed away a few years ago, and I've been working to put myself through community college." "Your mother," he repeated slowly. "What was her name?" Now I was definitely confused. Why would he care about my mother's name? "Linda Collins, sir. She worked at the textile factory downtown before it closed." Something definitely changed in his expression then. His eyes grew distant, and he was quiet for so long that I began to worry I had said something wrong. Mrs. Torres stepped forward slightly, her own expression showing concern. "Mr. Blackwood?" she said quietly. He seemed to shake himself back to the present. "Yes, of course. Well, Miss Collins, I think you'll find the work here straightforward enough. You'll be helping me organize some personal papers, updating records, that sort of thing. Mrs. Torres will show you to the small office where you'll be working." The interview was clearly over, but something felt unfinished. The way he had reacted to my mother's name, the strange looks he kept giving me. I wanted to ask about it, but you don't question a man like Richard Blackwood when you desperately need the job he's offering. Mrs. Torres led me out of the study and down another hallway to a smaller room that had been set up as an office. It had a desk, a computer, and several filing cabinets that looked like they contained decades' worth of documents. A window looked out over the estate's gardens, and I could see staff members tending to the grounds with the kind of careful attention that only comes from years of practice. "You'll start here," Mrs. Torres said, her tone all business again. "Mr. Blackwood will give you specific instructions each morning. Lunch is at noon in the staff dining room. You're welcome to use the facilities, but please remember that the family's private quarters are off-limits unless specifically requested." I nodded, trying to absorb all the information while still processing the strange interview I'd just had. "Mrs. Torres, can I ask something?" She raised an eyebrow. "What is it? Has Mr. Blackwood ever mentioned knowing anyone named Linda Collins?" "My mother?" It just seemed like he recognized the name. Mrs. Torres's expression became carefully neutral, which somehow felt more telling than if she had just said no. "Mr. Blackwood knows many people in town, Miss Collins. The Blackwood family has deep roots in Millbrook Valley." It wasn't really an answer, but it was clear that was all I was going to get. She left me alone in the office with a stack of papers to organize and a growing sense that there was more to this job than anyone was telling me. As I started working through the files, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The way Mr. Blackwood had looked at me, the way Mrs. Torres had deflected my question. There was something here, some connection I couldn't quite grasp. But for now, I had work to do and bills to pay. Whatever secrets Blackwood Estate was hiding would have to wait. The morning passed quietly as I organized invoices and correspondence, but I kept catching myself staring out the window at the gardens, wondering what it would be like to actually belong in a place like this. To walk these halls like you owned them, to sit in those beautiful rooms without feeling like an imposter. It seemed impossible, like a fantasy from someone else's life. Little did I know that by the end of my time at Blackwood Estate, I would discover that it wasn't a fantasy at all. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and the truth about why would change everything I thought I knew about my own story. The next few days at Blackwood Estate passed in a blur of routine that I desperately tried to master. Every morning I would arrive through the staff entrance at exactly 8 o'clock, my coffee-stained travel mug in hand, and my second-hand bag slung over my shoulder. The contrast between me and the other staff members became more apparent each day. They moved through the estate with practiced ease, their uniforms crisp, and their routines perfected through years of service. I, on the other hand, felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, afraid that any wrong move would expose me as the fraud I felt I was. Mrs. Torres had assigned me a small desk in what used to be a butler's pantry, converted into a makeshift office space. The room was tucked away from the main flow of the house, which I initially thought was a blessing. At least I wouldn't be constantly reminded of how out of place I was. But as the days wore on, I began to realize that my isolation wasn't accidental. The other staff members were polite but distant, offering polite nods when we passed in the hallways but never engaging in real conversation. It was like I existed in a bubble within their world, present but not really part of anything. The work itself was straightforward enough, though oddly personal for a temporary position. Mr. Blackwood had me organizing what seemed like decades of correspondence, financial records, and personal documents. Some of the papers dated back to the 1980s, yellowed with age and filled with handwriting that spoke of business deals, family matters, and the complex web of relationships that came with wealth and influence. I found myself getting lost in the stories these documents told, glimpses into a world where decisions involved millions of dollars and affected hundreds of lives. What struck me most was how methodical everything was. Every letter was dated, every receipt was filed, every document had its place in an elaborate system that someone had maintained with religious devotion. It was the kind of organizational precision that came from having the resources to do things properly, something I had never experienced in my own chaotic life of juggled jobs and constant financial stress. On my third day, while sorting through a box of correspondence from the early 1990s, I came across something that made my heart skip. It was a letter addressed to Richard Blackwood, but the return address caught my eye immediately. It was from the Millbrook textile factory, the same factory where my mother had worked before it closed down. The same factory that had been the backbone of our small town's economy, until corporate buyouts and changing markets had left hundreds of families without work. I held the letter carefully, my hands trembling slightly as I read the formal business correspondence. It was about a work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Workers' compensation claim. Routine paperwork. That probably meant nothing to Mr. Blackwood at the time. But seeing that familiar letterhead brought back a flood of memories. My mother coming home exhausted every night, her hands stained with dye and her back aching from hours of standing at the machines. The way her face had looked when the factory announced it was closing. That mixture of resignation and fear that I had been too young to fully understand at the time. The factory closure had been devastating for Millbrook. My mother had struggled to find steady work afterward, taking on cleaning jobs and part-time positions that never quite added up to a living wage. We had moved from a small house on the good side of town to the cramped apartment in Riverside, and I had watched my mother work herself to exhaustion trying to keep us afloat. She never complained, never made me feel like her struggles were my fault, but I knew that losing that factory job had changed the trajectory of our entire lives. Now here I was, in the home of someone who had probably been involved in the business decisions that affected my mother's livelihood. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was organizing the papers of a man whose world had likely contributed to my family's downfall, and I was grateful for the opportunity. That afternoon, Mr. Blackwood stopped by my makeshift office to check on my progress. He moved quietly for such a large man, and I didn't hear him approaching until he cleared his throat softly behind me. I jumped, nearly knocking over my coffee mug. "I apologize for startling you, Miss Collins," he said, though his eyes were already scanning the documents I had spread across the desk. "How are you finding the work?" "It's going well, sir," I replied, quickly gathering the papers into neat stacks. Your filing system is very thorough. Whoever maintained these records over the years did excellent work. He smiled slightly at that, the first genuine expression of warmth I had seen from him. That would have been my late wife's doing, primarily. Catherine was meticulous about such things. She believed that a family's history was only as good as the records they kept of it. The mention of his wife brought a softness to his features that made him seem more human, less like the intimidating figure I had first encountered. I had heard whispers among the staff that Mrs. Blackwood had passed away several years ago, but no one spoke of it directly in my presence. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, I offered carefully. She was, he said, and for a moment, his guard seemed to drop completely. She would have liked you, I think. She always said that the measure of a person wasn't where they came from, but what they chose to do with the opportunities they were given. Something in his tone made me look up at him more directly. He was studying me again with that same intense focus I had noticed during our first meeting, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite piece together. Mr. Blackwood, I said hesitantly, I found some correspondence from the textile factory in these files, the one where my mother used to work. I hope it's not inappropriate to mention, but I was wondering if you had any involvement with the factory before it closed. His expression changed immediately, becoming guarded again. The brief moment of openness disappeared, replaced by the careful neutrality I was becoming accustomed to from the Blackwood family. The textile factory, he repeated slowly. Yes, Blackwood Industries had some business relationships with the factory over the years. Why do you ask? I felt like I was treading on dangerous ground, but something compelled me to continue. It's just that losing that job was really hard on my family. My mother never really recovered financially from the closure. I suppose I'm curious about what happened, from a business perspective. Mr. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully measured. Business decisions often have consequences that extend far beyond the boardroom, Miss Collins. Sometimes we don't fully understand the impact of our choices until much later. It wasn't really an answer, but there was something in his tone that suggested regret. Maybe even guilt. Before I could respond, he had already turned to leave. Continue with the filing, he said over his shoulder. And Miss Collins? If you come across anything that seems particularly important or unusual, please let me know immediately. After he left, I sat staring at the textile factory correspondence for a long time. There was clearly more to the story than anyone was telling me, and Mr. Blackwood's reaction had only deepened my suspicions. But I was a temporary employee organizing old papers, not a detective investigating family secrets. Whatever connections existed between the Blackwood family and my mother's struggles were probably none of my business. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. Every interaction with Mr. Blackwood felt loaded with subtext I couldn't decode. Every glance from Mrs. Torres seemed to carry some hidden meaning. Even the other staff members seemed to watch me with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as if they knew something about my presence at the estate that I didn't. The feeling of being an outsider intensified over the following days. I began to notice the subtle ways the Blackwood family moved through their world, the effortless confidence that came from never having to question their place in it. Margaret Blackwood, Richard's wife, was a perfectly composed woman who seemed to glide rather than walk. Her clothes were understated but obviously expensive, and she spoke to the staff with the kind of polite distance that maintained clear boundaries while never being outright rude. Their son James was a different story entirely. He was probably in his mid-30s, handsome in the way that expensive grooming and good genetics could make anyone attractive. But there was something dismissive in his manner that set my teeth on edge. He treated the staff like furniture, acknowledging their presence only when he needed something. When Mrs. Graham Torres introduced us briefly in the hallway, he looked at me like I was an interesting but ultimately insignificant addition to the household help. Another temp worker, he had said to his mother, not even bothering to address me directly. I don't understand why Father insists on bringing in outsiders for simple administrative work. Margaret had murmured something non-committal in response, but I caught the way her eyes flickered toward me with something that might have been sympathy. Or maybe I was just projecting my own discomfort onto her expression. Victoria, their daughter, was harder to read. She was closer to my age and seemed more aware of the social dynamics at play in the house. When we passed each other in the hallways, she would nod politely and sometimes even offer a brief smile. But there was always something guarded about her interactions, as if she was constantly calculating the appropriate level of friendliness to display towards someone in my position. It was during my second week at the estate that I first began to understand just how much of an outsider I really was. I had been working late, trying to catch up on a particularly complex set of financial records that dated back to the early 2000s. The main house had grown quiet around me, with most of the staff having finished their duties for the day. I was so absorbed in my work that I didn't notice the voices in the hallway until they were almost directly outside my door. "I still don't understand why you hired her," Margaret's voice was saying, clear and crisp in the evening silence. "Mrs. Torres could have handled the filing herself, or we could have brought in someone from the regular agency." "It seemed like the right thing to do," Mr. Blackwood replied, though there was something strained in his tone. "And she's doing excellent work." "That's not the point, Richard." Margaret's voice carried the kind of exasperation that suggested this was an ongoing conversation. "You're taking unnecessary risks. What if she starts asking questions? What if she figures out the connection?" "There may not be a connection to figure out," Mr. Blackwood said, but he didn't sound convinced. "And even if there is, she has a right to know." "Does she?" Margaret's voice turned sharp. "After all these years? After everything we've built here? You would risk our family's privacy, our security, for the sake of some misguided sense of obligation?" Their voices began to fade as they moved further down the hallway, but I had heard enough to set my mind racing. What connection were they talking about? What was it that I supposedly had a right to know? And why did my presence at the estate seem to be causing such tension within the family? I sat in my small office, surrounded by decades of Blackwood family documents, and realized that I wasn't just an outsider looking in. I was apparently at the center of some family secret that I didn't even know existed. The question was whether I had the courage to figure out what it was, and whether I was prepared for the consequences of learning the truth. The rest of that evening, I found myself looking at every document with new eyes, searching for any clue that might explain the mysterious connection Margaret had referenced. But the papers revealed nothing obvious, just the normal flow of a wealthy family's business and personal affairs. Whatever secret the Blackwoods were keeping, it wasn't hidden in plain sight among their correspondence and financial records. As I finally packed up my things and prepared to leave for the night, I caught a glimpse of myself in the ornate mirror that hung in the hallway. I looked tired and uncertain, my cheap clothes wrinkled from a long day of work, my hair escaping from the professional bun I had attempted that morning. I looked exactly like what I was, a working-class girl who had stumbled into a world she didn't understand, trying to piece together a puzzle that might change everything she thought she knew about her own life. The walk back to my car felt longer than usual, and as I drove through the estate gates and back toward my modest apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving behind more than just a day's work. I was leaving behind questions that demanded answers, secrets that begged to be uncovered, and a growing sense that my connection to Blackwood Estate ran deeper than anyone was willing to admit. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my small bedroom, my mind churning with possibilities. Who was Linda Collins to the Blackwood family? What had happened between my mother and Richard Blackwood that could cause such tension decades later? And, most importantly, what right did I supposedly have to know the truth? I had always believed that my mother's life had been shaped by economic circumstances beyond her control, by the simple bad luck of working for a factory that couldn't survive changing times. But what if there was more to the story? What if the struggles that had defined my childhood and shaped my adult life were connected to the very family I was now working for? The questions multiplied in the darkness, each one leading to more uncertainty. By the time I finally fell asleep, I had made a decision. I was going to find out the truth about my connection to Blackwood Estate, regardless of the consequences. I owed it to my mother's memory, and I owed it to myself, to understand the forces that had shaped our lives. Little did I know that my search for answers would lead me to discoveries that would challenge everything I believed about my identity, my family, and my place in the world. The feeling of being an outsider at Blackwood Estate was about to give way to something far more complex and life-changing than I could have ever imagined. The decision to dig deeper into my family's connection to the Blackwoods consumed my thoughts for days. I found myself arriving at work earlier each morning, staying later each evening, not just to complete my assigned tasks, but to search through the documents with more intentional purpose. I had become a detective in my own life story, and the evidence was scattered throughout decades of carefully preserved papers. It was during one of these extended evening sessions that I made my first real discovery. I had been working through a box of personal correspondence from the late 1990s when I found a folder that had been misfiled among the business documents. The tab read "Personal Confidential" in what I had learned to recognize as Catherine Blackwood's meticulous handwriting. Inside were letters, photographs, and documents that seemed far more intimate than the usual business affairs I had been organizing. Most of the contents were family-related. Letters between Catherine and her children, holiday cards from friends, the usual accumulation of a life well lived. But near the bottom of the folder, I found something that made my breath catch. It was a photograph, slightly faded but still clear enough to see the details. The picture showed a young woman who looked strikingly familiar, standing next to Richard Blackwood, who appeared to be in his early 30s. They were both smiling, standing in front of what looked like the textile factory's main building. The woman in the photograph had my mother's eyes, my mother's smile, even my mother's way of tilting her head slightly when she was genuinely happy. But this version of my mother was younger than I had ever seen her, dressed in clothes that suggested this photo had been taken in the early 1980s, long before I was born. She looked confident, even radiant, in a way that I had rarely seen in my own memories of her. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, "Richard and Linda, summer 1983, new beginnings." The handwriting wasn't Catherine's careful script, and it wasn't Richard's either, based on the signatures I had seen on various documents. This was someone else's notation, someone who had thought this moment was important enough to document. I stared at the photograph for what felt like hours, my mind racing with implications. This wasn't just a casual business relationship between a factory owner and an employee. The way they were standing together, the genuine warmth in their smiles, the intimate nature of the pose, suggested something much more personal. But what exactly had happened between my mother and Richard Blackwood? And why had no one ever mentioned it? The more I studied the photograph, the more questions arose. If my mother and Richard had some kind of relationship in the early 1980s, why had she ended up struggling as a factory worker? Why had she never mentioned knowing the Blackwood family? And most troubling of all, why had Richard hired me if he knew about this connection? Was it guilt, obligation, or something else entirely? I carefully replaced the photograph in the folder, but I made a mental note of its location. This was evidence of something significant, though I wasn't yet sure what. The next step would be to find more pieces of the puzzle, to build a timeline that might explain the mysterious connection between my family and the Blackwoods. Over the following days, I began to pay closer attention to the dates on the documents I was filing. I started looking for any correspondence from the early to mid-1980s that might shed light on the relationship suggested by the photograph. What I found was a gradual shift in the tone of Richard's business correspondence during that period. In the early 1980s, his letters about the textile factory were warm and optimistic, full of plans for expansion and community development. But by the mid-1980s, the tone had changed dramatically. The letters became formal, distant, focused solely on profit margins and cost-cutting measures. The shift seemed to coincide with changes in Richard's personal life as well. I found wedding invitations for his marriage to Catherine in 1985, engagement announcements in the local newspaper, and correspondence about elaborate wedding plans. But there was something missing from the timeline, a gap in the personal correspondence that suggested turmoil or transition during that period. It was Mrs. Torres who inadvertently provided the next clue. I had been working in the main library one afternoon, organizing some books that Richard wanted relocated, when she entered to dust the furniture. She moved efficiently through the room, her attention focused on her work, But when she saw me handling a particular leather-bound photo album, she stopped abruptly. "That album contains family photographs," she said, her voice carrying a warning tone. "It's not part of your filing responsibilities." "I apologize," I said quickly, setting the album aside. Mr. Blackwood asked me to organize all the books in this section, and I wasn't sure if photo albums were included. Mrs. Torres approached the table where I had placed the album, her expression unreadable. She opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the edges of the photographs inside. For a moment, her professional composure seemed to slip, replaced by something that looked like sadness or regret. "This family has many memories," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "Not all of them are meant to be shared." "Mrs. Torres," I said carefully, "can I ask you something? How long have you worked for the Blackwood family?" She looked up at me, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. 38 years, she said. "I started working here when I was 20, fresh out of high school. I've seen this family through many changes. So you would have been here in the early 1980s, I continued, trying to keep my voice casual. "You must have known the family when they were involved with the textile factory." Her expression became guarded immediately. "I was here, yes, but my job is to manage the household, not to discuss family history with temporary employees." The rebuke was gentle but firm, and I knew I was pushing too hard. But Mrs. Torres continued to study me with that same intense focus I had noticed from Richard, as if she was trying to reconcile something in her own mind. "Miss Collins," she said finally, "may I ask you a personal question?" I nodded, surprised by the shift in her demeanor. "Your mother, Linda Collins. Did she ever speak about her time at the textile factory? About the people she worked with there?" The question caught me off guard. She talked about the work sometimes, about how difficult the conditions were, and how sad she was when it closed. But she never mentioned specific people. "Why do you ask?" Mrs. Torres closed the photo album carefully and picked it up, holding it against her chest like it contained precious secrets. "Sometimes the past has a way of finding us, even when we think we've left it behind. Your mother was a good woman, Miss Collins. I hope you know that." Before I could ask what she meant, she had already left the library, taking the photo album with her. But her words echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. How could Mrs. Torres know that my mother was a good woman unless she had known her personally? And why was everyone in this family so reluctant to discuss what had clearly been a significant relationship? That evening, I decided to change my approach. Instead of looking through family documents, I would research public records and newspaper archives to see what I could learn about the textile factory's history and the Blackwood family's involvement with it. The Millbrook Library stayed open until 9 on weeknights, and their local history section might contain information that wasn't filtered through the family's careful narrative control. The library's microfiche collection contained decades of the Millbrook Gazette, and I spent hours scrolling through newspapers from the early 1980s. What I found painted a picture of a community in transition, with the textile factory serving as the economic anchor for hundreds of families. Richard Blackwood was frequently mentioned in business articles, portrayed as a young entrepreneur with ambitious plans for modernizing the factory and expanding its operations. But it was a Society Page article from August 1983 that provided the most illuminating detail. The headline read, "Local business leader announces engagement," and the accompanying article described Richard Blackwood's engagement to Catherine Morrison, daughter of a prominent Hartford banking family. The article mentioned that the engagement had been long anticipated by both families, and that a spring wedding was planned for the following year. The timing troubled me. If Richard had been engaged to Catherine in August 1983, why did the photograph show him looking so happy and intimate with my mother that same summer? Had there been an affair? A broken engagement that was later mended? Or was the situation more complicated than I could piece together from newspaper clippings and old photographs? I continued searching through the newspaper archives, looking for any mention of my mother or any unusual developments at the textile factory during that period. What I found was a small article from September 1983, buried on page 6, with the headline, "Factory Worker Injured in Industrial Accident." The brief article mentioned that Linda Collins, a 22-year-old employee, had been hospitalized following an accident with machinery at the textile factory. The article stated that she was in stable condition and that the factory was conducting a full investigation into the incident. The article was dated just weeks after the photograph had been taken, and I felt a chill as I realized the implications. My mother had been injured at the factory right around the time of Richard's engagement announcement. Was this a coincidence? Or was there a connection between these events that I was only beginning to understand? I printed copies of the newspaper articles and drove home in a daze, my mind spinning with new questions and disturbing possibilities. If my mother had been injured at the factory, why had she continued working there for years afterward? Why had she never mentioned knowing Richard Blackwood, especially if they had been close enough to pose for photographs together? And what role had the Blackwood family played in the aftermath of her accident? That night I spread the newspaper clippings and my notes across my small kitchen table, trying to construct a timeline that made sense of the evidence I had gathered. The picture that emerged was troubling and incomplete, but it suggested that my mother's life had been shaped by events and relationships that she had never shared with me. The industrial accident seemed to mark a turning point in the timeline. Before September 1983, the newspaper coverage of the textile factory was optimistic and forward-looking. Richard Blackwood was portrayed as a visionary leader who cared about his workers and the community. But after the accident, the tone of the coverage changed subtly. The factory's expansion plans were quietly shelved, and Richard's public statements became more focused on efficiency and cost control than on worker welfare. By 1985, when Richard married Catherine, the textile factory was already showing signs of the decline that would eventually lead to its closure. The warm, community-minded businessman of the early 1980s had been replaced by someone more distant and calculating, someone who seemed to view the factory purely as a business proposition rather than a community institution. I couldn't help but wonder if my mother's accident had been the catalyst for this change. Had something happened during her hospitalization that altered the relationship between the Blackwood family and the factory workers? Had Richard's engagement to Catherine been influenced by whatever had transpired with my mother? And most importantly, what had happened to my mother during those critical weeks in the fall of 1983 that had apparently changed the course of multiple lives? As I stared at the evidence spread across my table, I realized that I was no longer just organizing old papers for a temporary job. I was uncovering a family secret that had been carefully buried for decades, and every new piece of information I discovered made the mystery deeper and more personal. The feeling of being an outsider at Blackwood Estate was beginning to give way to something more unsettling. The suspicion that I might actually belong there in ways that no one was willing to acknowledge. The next morning, I arrived at work with a new sense of purpose. I had spent the weekend researching everything I could find about my mother's time at the textile factory, and I was determined to find more concrete answers about her relationship with the Blackwood family. The photograph and newspaper articles had provided tantalizing clues, but I needed more substantial evidence to understand what had really happened in the 1980s. Mrs. Torres greeted me at the staff entrance with her usual professional courtesy, but I thought I detected something different in her manner. She seemed more watchful, more alert to my presence than she had been in previous weeks. It was as if she sensed that something had changed in my approach to the work, that I was no longer just a temporary employee going through the motions of filing documents. "Mr. Blackwood would like to see you in his study before you begin work today," she informed me, her voice carefully neutral. "He has some specific instructions about the documents you'll be handling this week." I followed her through the familiar hallways to Richard's study, my stomach tight with apprehension. Had someone discovered that I had been researching the family's history? Had I crossed a line by looking through personal photographs and newspaper archives? Or was this meeting about something else entirely? Richard was standing by the window when we entered, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the estate grounds. He turned when he heard us approach, and I was struck again by the intensity of his gaze when it fell on me. There was something different about his expression today, a mixture of resignation and determination that I hadn't seen before. "Thank you, Mrs. Torres," he said. "Please close the door behind you." After Mrs. Torres left, Richard gestured for me to sit in the same chair I had occupied during our first meeting. He remained standing, which somehow made the moment feel more formal and intimidating. "Miss Collins," he began, his voice measured and careful. "I understand that you've been asking questions about your mother's time at the textile factory." My heart began to race, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. "I've been curious about the connection, yes. I found some documents that mentioned the factory, and it brought back memories of that time in my mother's life." Richard nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response. "I see. And what exactly have you discovered in your research?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I found a photograph," I said finally. "One that showed my mother with you at the factory in 1983. I was surprised because she never mentioned knowing you personally." For a long moment, Richard was silent. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, tinged with something that sounded like regret. "Your mother was an exceptional woman, Miss Collins. Intelligent, compassionate, and determined to make a better life for herself. She didn't deserve what happened to her." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that I was afraid to examine too closely. "What did happen to her?" I asked quietly. Richard moved to his desk and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 65 years. "That," he said, "is a conversation that will change everything you think you know about your family and mine. Are you certain you're prepared for that?" I thought about my mother, about the struggles that had defined her life and shaped mine, about the questions that had haunted me since I first walked through the gates of Blackwood Estate. Whatever the truth was, I needed to know it. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm ready to hear it." Richard reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder that looked worn with age. He placed it on the desk between us, his hand resting on top of it as if he was reluctant to let it go. "Very well," he said. "But understand that once I tell you this story, there will be no going back to the way things were. Your life and mine will never be the same." Richard opened the manila folder slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. Inside were documents I had never seen before, photographs that predated anything in the family's official records, and what appeared to be legal papers that had been kept separate from the main filing system. He selected a photograph from the top of the stack and placed it face up on the desk, where I could see it clearly. This photograph was different from the one I had found earlier. It showed my mother, unmistakably younger and radiant, sitting in what appeared to be a hospital bed. She was holding a baby, and beside her sat Richard, his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking down at the infant, with expressions of pure joy and wonder. The timestamp on the photograph read, October 15th, 1983. My world tilted on its axis. The baby in the photograph was clearly newborn, tiny and wrapped in a hospital blanket. The timeline clicked into place with devastating clarity. September 1983, my mother's industrial accident. October 1983, a baby born in the hospital. I was born in October 1983. The industrial accident hadn't been an accident at all. It had been labor, and my birth. "I don't understand," I whispered, though part of me was beginning to understand all too well. Richard's voice was gentle when he spoke, the voice of a man who had carried a heavy secret for far too long. "Your mother and I were in love, Emma. Deeply, completely in love, but I was also engaged to Catherine, an arrangement that had been made by our families for business and social reasons. When Linda told me she was pregnant, I was faced with an impossible choice. I stared at the photograph, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch it. "Are you saying that you're my father?" "I am your father," he confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I have regretted every day since then, not being able to claim you openly, not being able to give you the life you deserved." The room seemed to spin around me. Everything I had believed about my identity, my family, my place in the world, was crumbling and rebuilding itself in the space of a few sentences. Richard Blackwood, the wealthy estate owner I had felt so intimidated by, was my father. The Blackwood Estate, where I had felt like such an outsider, was actually my birthright. "But why?" I managed to ask. "Why didn't you leave Catherine? Why didn't you marry my mother instead?" Richard's face contorted with pain. I tried to. God knows I tried to find a way to make it work. But my engagement to Catherine wasn't just personal, Emma. It was a merger between two powerful families, with millions of dollars and hundreds of jobs hanging in the balance. My father made it clear that if I broke the engagement, he would cut me off completely, and the textile factory would be closed immediately. That factory employed 300 people, Emma, 300 families who depended on those jobs to survive. I felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. So you chose money over love. You chose the factory over my mother. I chose to try to protect everyone, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I thought I could find a way to honor my commitment to Catherine while still taking care of Linda and you. I was young and arrogant, and I believed I could manage everything perfectly. I was wrong. He pulled out another document from the folder, this one clearly a legal agreement. I set up a trust fund for you, Emma. It was supposed to ensure that you and your mother would never want for anything. The money was supposed to cover your education, health care, living expenses, everything you would need for a comfortable life. I stared at the document, seeing my name listed as the beneficiary of what appeared to be a substantial amount of money. I never saw any of this money. We struggled my entire childhood. My mother worked multiple jobs just to keep us afloat. Richard's expression grew dark with something that looked like rage, but not directed at me. Your mother never touched the money. She was too proud, too angry, too hurt by what she saw as my betrayal. I tried to convince her to take it, for your sake if not for hers, but she refused every overture I made. She said she would rather struggle with dignity than live comfortably on what she called blood money. The pieces of my childhood suddenly made sense in a new and painful way. My mother's fierce independence, her refusal to accept help from anyone, her insistence that we could make it on our own no matter how difficult things became. She hadn't just been proud. She had been heartbroken and angry, and determined to prove that she didn't need anything from the man who had abandoned her. She loved you, I said, the words coming out more as an accusation than a statement. And I loved her, Richard replied immediately. I have never stopped loving her, Emma. Marrying Catherine was the biggest mistake of my life, and I have paid for it every single day since. I thought about Catherine's words that I had overheard in the hallway, about the risks of my presence at the estate. Does your family know about me? Richard nodded reluctantly. Catherine has known from the beginning. It was part of our agreement when we married. She insisted that I have no contact with Linda or with you, and in return she would pretend the affair had never happened. Mrs. Torres knows as well. She was here when everything happened, and she has kept the secret all these years. And your children? James and Victoria believe you are simply a temporary employee. They have no idea of your true identity. He paused, studying my face carefully. The question now is what we do with this information. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I had just learned. In the space of an hour, I had gone from being Emma Collins, struggling temp worker, to being Emma Blackwood, secret daughter of one of the wealthiest families in Connecticut. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had spent weeks feeling like an outsider when I was actually more of an insider than anyone else in the house. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Why did you hire me in the first place if you knew who I was? Richard leaned forward, his eyes intense. Because when I saw you at that agency, when you told me your name and mentioned your mother, I realized I couldn't let another day pass without knowing my daughter. I told myself I was hiring you just to observe you, to see what kind of person you had become. But the truth is, I was hoping for exactly this moment. I was hoping you would discover the truth and give me a chance to explain. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. This man, this wealthy, powerful man, had been watching me, learning about me, hoping to build a relationship with me while I remained completely unaware of our connection. It should have felt manipulative, and part of it did, but I could also see the desperation in his eyes, the longing of a father who had missed his daughter's entire life. What about the trust fund? I asked. Is it still there? Every penny, plus 30 years of compound interest. You're worth approximately $12 million, Emma. You have been since the day you were born. $12 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless. I had spent my entire life counting every dollar, working multiple jobs, stressing about rent and groceries and car repairs. And all this time, there had been $12 million sitting in an account with my name on it. I could have gone to college, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. I could have helped my mother when she got sick. I could have paid for better health care, better treatment. She might still be alive if I had known about this money. Richard's face crumpled with grief. I know. God, Emma, I know. I tried so many times to find a way to get the money to Linda without her knowing it came from me. I even considered having a lawyer contact her anonymously, claiming it was from a forgotten insurance policy or something similar. But I was afraid she would see through the deception and disappear entirely. I was afraid I would lose any chance of ever seeing you. So you let her die in poverty instead, I said, the words coming out harsher than I had intended. I let her make her own choices, he replied quietly, even when those choices broke my heart. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us absorbing the weight of 3 decades of missed opportunities and painful decisions. I thought about my mother, about the sacrifices she had made and the pride that had prevented her from accepting help even when we desperately needed it. I thought about Richard, about the impossible position he had been placed in as a young man, and the consequences of the choice he had made. And I thought about myself, about the life I could have lived and the person I might have become if I had grown up knowing the truth about my identity. There's something else, Richard said eventually, reaching for another document in the folder. Something I need to tell you about the estate. He handed me what appeared to be a legal document, thick with official seals and complex language. As I scanned through it, certain phrases jumped out at me: sole beneficiary, inheritance, Blackwood Estate, and all associated properties. This is a will, I said, looking up at him in confusion. My will, he confirmed. Updated just last week. James and Victoria will receive substantial trust funds, enough to ensure they never want for anything. But the estate itself, the family business, the legacy that has been built over generations, that all goes to you. I stared at the document, unable to process what I was reading. But they're your legitimate children. They're the ones who grew up here, who understand this world. You're my daughter, Richard interrupted firmly. And more than that, you're the daughter who inherited your mother's strength, her determination, her ability to build something from nothing. James has never worked a day in his life. Victoria is well-meaning but has no interest in business or responsibility. You, Emma, you have already proven that you can succeed, despite having every disadvantage. Imagine what you could accomplish with every advantage. The implications were staggering. Not only was I a secret Blackwood, not only was I worth $12 million in my own right, but I was also heir to an estate and business empire worth hundreds of millions. The temp worker who had felt so out of place in this world was actually destined to inherit it all. I need time to think about this, I said, standing up on shaky legs. This is too much to process all at once. Richard nodded understandingly. Take all the time you need. But Emma, I want you to know that whatever you decide about the inheritance, whatever you choose to do with this information, I am proud to be your father. I have watched you these past few weeks, seen your work ethic, your integrity, your kindness to the staff. You have become an extraordinary woman despite everything that was stacked against you. Linda would be so proud of who you've become. I left Richard's study in a daze, walking through the hallways of Blackwood Estate with entirely new eyes. These weren't just beautiful rooms filled with expensive furniture. This was my inheritance, my birthright, my future, if I chose to claim it. The portraits on the walls weren't just decorations. They were my ancestors, generations of Blackwoods who had built and maintained this legacy that was now being offered to me. Mrs. Torres was waiting for me in the hallway outside the study, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had clearly been anticipating this conversation for years, wondering when and how the truth would finally come out. "How long have you known who I was?" I asked her directly. "From the moment I saw you," she replied. "You have your mother's eyes and your father's stubborn chin. I helped deliver you in that hospital room 30 years ago, Emma. I have been waiting for this day ever since." "Did you think I deserved to know the truth?" Mrs. Torres considered the question carefully. "I thought you deserved to know your father, and he deserved to know his daughter. The circumstances that kept you apart were complicated, but love should not be complicated. Family should not be complicated." That afternoon, I left Blackwood Estate early, claiming I wasn't feeling well, which was certainly true, even if it had nothing to do with physical illness. I drove aimlessly through Millbrook Valley, seeing my hometown through completely different eyes. I was no longer just Emma Collins from Riverside Apartments. I was Emma Blackwood, daughter of one of the most powerful families in Connecticut, heir to a fortune that could change not just my life, but the lives of everyone I cared about. I thought about my best friend Sarah, still working double shifts at the diner to make ends meet. I thought about my neighbors in Riverside Apartments, struggling with medical bills and car repairs, and all the financial pressures that had defined my own life until this morning. I thought about my mother, who had died without ever telling me the truth about my father, who had chosen pride and independence over security and comfort. That evening, I called Sarah and asked her to meet me at our usual coffee shop downtown. I needed to talk to someone, to process what I had learned, but I couldn't bring myself to reveal the whole truth. Instead, I told her that I had discovered some family history that complicated my understanding of my identity. "You're being mysterious," Sarah said, studying my face across the small table. "What kind of family history are we talking about here? Did you find out you're adopted or something?" "Something like that," I said carefully. "It turns out my mother kept some significant secrets from me about my father and our family's background." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Whatever it is, Emma, you're still you. Your worth isn't determined by who your parents were or where you came from. You've built your own life, made your own choices. That's what matters." Her words were meant to be comforting, but they highlighted the central dilemma I was facing. If I accepted my inheritance, if I claimed my place as a Blackwood, would I still be the same person? Would I become someone like James, entitled and disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people? Would I lose the empathy and work ethic that my difficult upbringing had instilled in me? On the other hand, what good was my work ethic and empathy if I didn't have the resources to make a real difference in the world? $12 million could fund scholarships for dozens of students from backgrounds like mine. The Blackwood Estate could be used for charitable purposes, as a venue for community events, as a symbol of what was possible, rather than a monument to exclusivity. I spent the next few days in a strange liminal space, continuing to work at the estate while grappling with the knowledge that I was actually its future owner. The other staff members treated me exactly as they always had, unaware that the temp worker they barely acknowledged was actually their future employer. James and Victoria continued to interact with me with polite indifference, having no idea that I was their half-sister, and the person who would inherit everything they probably assumed would be theirs. The strangest interactions were with Richard himself. Now that the truth was out between us, he seemed desperate to build some kind of relationship, to make up for 30 years of absence in whatever way possible. He began stopping by my office more frequently, ostensibly to check on my work, but really just to talk. He would share stories about my mother, about their brief time together, about the dreams they had shared for a different kind of future. "She wanted to travel," he told me one afternoon, his voice wistful. "Linda had never been anywhere outside of Connecticut, and she used to talk about seeing the ocean, visiting different cities, experiencing the world beyond Millbrook Valley. I promised her that we would travel together someday, that I would show her everything she wanted to see." These conversations were bittersweet, offering glimpses of the life my mother might have lived if circumstances had been different, but they also served to highlight everything that had been lost, all the experiences and opportunities that had been sacrificed on the altar of social expectations and family obligations. It was during one of these conversations that Richard made an offer that crystallized my decision about the inheritance. "I know this is all overwhelming," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. And I know that accepting your inheritance means accepting a level of responsibility you never asked for. But Emma, you have the opportunity to do something truly meaningful with this legacy. You could use the Blackwood name and resources to make a real difference in people's lives. To honor your mother's memory in ways that I never could. What do you mean? I asked. The textile factory building is still standing. Still owned by Blackwood Industries. It's been empty for years, but the structure is sound. You could convert it into something that serves the community. Something that provides opportunities for people from backgrounds like yours. A business incubator, an educational center, a place where people can develop skills and build better lives for themselves. The idea resonated with me immediately. The textile factory that had represented my mother's struggles could become a symbol of hope and opportunity for others facing similar challenges. Instead of being a monument to economic inequality, it could become a place where that inequality was actively addressed. And the estate itself, Richard continued, could be opened to the community in ways it never has been before. The gardens could host events for local organizations. The library could be used for educational programs. You could maintain the family's privacy while still sharing the resources in meaningful ways. I could see it all clearly in my mind's eye. The empty factory humming with activity again, but this time focused on empowerment rather than exploitation. The estate grounds filled with people from all walks of life, celebrating achievements and building connections across social and economic boundaries. The Blackwood name associated not with exclusivity and privilege, but with opportunity and community service. There's something else, Richard said, his voice growing more serious. Something I haven't told you about your mother's final years. I looked up at him, sensing that this revelation would be significant. After she got sick, Linda reached out to me. Not for money, not for help with medical bills, but because she wanted to make sure you would be taken care of after she was gone. She asked me to promise that I would find a way to be part of your life, that I wouldn't let pride or fear keep me from knowing my daughter. The words hit me like a physical blow. My mother, in her final months, had been thinking not about her own struggles, but about my future. She had swallowed her pride and reached out to the man who had broken her heart because she wanted to ensure that I wouldn't be alone in the world. She made me promise that when the time was right, I would tell you the truth about your heritage and give you the choice about whether to claim it. She said that the decision should be yours, not mine, not hers, but yours alone. I felt tears streaming down my face as I realized that this entire situation, my presence at the estate, the gradual revelation of my identity, had all been orchestrated not by Richard's guilt or manipulation, but by my mother's final act of love. Even in death, she had been protecting me, ensuring that I would have options and opportunities that her own pride had prevented her from accepting. So you see, Richard concluded gently, accepting your inheritance isn't just about claiming your birthright. It's about honoring your mother's final wishes and using the resources she wanted you to have to build the kind of life she always dreamed was possible. That night, I made my decision. I would accept the inheritance, but on my own terms. I would use the Blackwood name and resources to create opportunities for others who had faced the same struggles my mother and I had experienced. I would transform the symbols of my family's separation into tools for bringing people together. The next morning, I walked into Richard's study with my head held high and my future finally clear in my mind. I'll take it, I said simply. All of it. But we're going to do things differently from now on. Richard's smile was radiant with relief and pride. I wouldn't expect anything less from Linda Collins' daughter. 6 months later, the Blackwood Community Center opened in the renovated textile factory building. The grand opening was attended by hundreds of people from throughout Millbrook Valley, including many former factory workers who had never imagined they would set foot in a Blackwood property again. The center offered job training programs, small business development resources, and educational opportunities for people of all ages and backgrounds. The estate itself had been partially converted into a conference and event center, hosting everything from weddings for working-class families to leadership retreats for nonprofit organizations. The Blackwood name, which had once represented exclusivity and social barriers, was becoming synonymous with opportunity and community empowerment. Standing in the main ballroom of the estate during the community center's opening celebration, Surrounded by people whose lives were being changed by programs funded with my inheritance, I finally understood what my mother had known all along. Home wasn't about the building you lived in or the money in your bank account. Home was about belonging, about contributing, about using whatever resources you had to make the world a better place for the people around you. I had started my journey at Blackwood Estate feeling like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong in a world of wealth and privilege. But I had discovered that I wasn't meant to simply fit into that world as it existed. I was meant to transform it, to use my unique perspective and experiences to bridge the gap between different communities and create something entirely new. The little girl who had grown up in Riverside apartments, who had worried about rent money and counted every dollar, was still part of who I was. But now she was also Emma Blackwood, heir to a legacy that she was determined to use for good. I had found my place in the world, not by accepting it as it was, but by changing it into what it could be. As I looked around the ballroom at faces both familiar and new, at former factory workers chatting with estate staff, at teenagers from downtown Millbrook learning about college opportunities from Victoria Blackwood, who had become one of my strongest allies in transforming the family legacy, I realized that feeling like an outsider had been exactly the perspective I needed to see what was possible. Sometimes the place where you belong isn't the place where you fit in easily. Sometimes it's the place where you can make the biggest difference, where your unique experiences and insights allow you to create something better than what existed before. Sometimes being an outsider is exactly what qualifies you to transform the inside. 5 years had passed since that morning when I first walked through the gates of Blackwood Estate as a desperate temp worker, and now I stood in the same spot, but everything had changed. The iron gates that once intimidated me now bore a bronze plaque that read, Blackwood Community Foundation, building bridges, creating opportunities. The manicured lawns still stretched endlessly toward the main house, but they were dotted with families enjoying picnics, children playing on carefully designed playground equipment, and groups of adults participating in outdoor fitness classes offered free to the community. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't been without its challenges. The first year after accepting my inheritance had been the most difficult of my life, filled with legal battles, family tensions, and the overwhelming responsibility of managing wealth that I had never been prepared to handle. James had initially contested the will, hiring expensive attorneys and claiming that I was an opportunistic fraud who had somehow manipulated his father. The legal proceedings had lasted 8 months, during which time I had questioned my decision almost daily. Victoria, surprisingly, had been my strongest ally within the family. Perhaps because she was closer to my age, or perhaps because she had always felt somewhat like an outsider herself in the world of old money expectations, she had embraced the idea of using the family's resources for social good. She had thrown herself into the planning for the community center with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. Her background in nonprofit work, which her parents had always seen as a frivolous pursuit unsuited to a Blackwood, suddenly became invaluable as we navigated the complex process of establishing charitable programs. The relationship with Richard had evolved slowly and carefully. The initial rush of emotion following our revelation had given way to the more complex work of actually building a father-daughter relationship after 30 years of absence. We met for coffee every Tuesday morning, a routine that had started awkwardly but had gradually become one of the most cherished parts of my week. He told me stories about my mother that I had never heard, shared memories of their brief time together that helped me understand both of them better. In return, I told him about my childhood, about my mother's strength during her illness, about the dreams and ambitions that had driven me through years of struggle. Perhaps most importantly, Richard had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Blackwood Industries, transitioning into an advisory role that allowed me to implement changes without having to battle entrenched corporate culture. The company had shifted its focus from pure profit maximization to what we called conscious capitalism, seeking investments and partnerships that generated both financial returns and positive social impact. It had taken time to convince the board of directors, and we had lost some investors who were uncomfortable with the new direction, but the company was more profitable than ever and had garnered national recognition for its innovative approach to corporate responsibility. The textile factory building had become the crown jewel of our community outreach efforts. The Blackwood Community Center housed a business incubator where aspiring entrepreneurs could access mentorship, funding, and workspace for their startups. The job training programs had helped hundreds of people transition into new careers, with a particular focus on green energy and technology sectors that offered stable, well-paying employment. The educational initiatives included everything from adult literacy classes to advanced computer programming courses, all offered free of charge to community members. But the program I was most proud of was the scholarship fund we had established in my mother's name. The Linda Collins Memorial Scholarship provided full college funding for students from low-income families, with a special emphasis on first-generation college students who faced the same barriers I had encountered. Each year, we awarded scholarships to 20 students, covering not just tuition but also living expenses, books, and even stipends for unpaid internships that wealthy students could afford to take, but working-class students typically couldn't. This year's scholarship recipients were particularly special to me because they included several students whose parents had worked at the original textile factory. Watching these young people walk across the stage at their high school graduations, knowing that they would have opportunities my mother's generation had been denied, felt like the completion of a circle that had been broken decades ago. Mrs. Torres had become far more than just the head housekeeper. She had evolved into my closest advisor and the unofficial historian of the Blackwood family transformation. Her institutional knowledge of how the estate operated, combined with her deep understanding of the local community, made her invaluable as we navigated the complexities of opening a traditionally exclusive space to the public. She had initially been skeptical of some of our more ambitious plans, worried that we would lose the dignity and elegance that had defined Blackwood Estate for generations. But as she watched families who had never set foot on the grounds before bringing their children to storytime in the library or their elderly parents to art classes in the conservatory, her skepticism had transformed into fierce pride. The estate itself had been carefully renovated to balance its new public function with the preservation of its historical character. The main house remained primarily private, with Richard, Catherine, and I each maintaining our own wings, but the public spaces had been expanded and made accessible. The library had become a community resource, with thousands of books available for lone and quiet study spaces that were used by everyone from high school students preparing for college entrance exams to retirees researching their family genealogies. The gardens had been redesigned to include educational components, with sections dedicated to sustainable agriculture, where community members could learn about organic farming techniques and even take home fresh produce. The old stables had been converted into an arts center where local artists could display their work and teach classes to people of all ages. Even the formal dining room was now used for community events, hosting everything from wedding receptions for families who could never have afforded such an elegant venue to recognition dinners for local volunteers and civic leaders. Catherine's adjustment to these changes had been perhaps the most difficult to navigate. For the first 2 years, she had maintained an icy politeness toward me, treating me as an unfortunate reality she had to endure, rather than as a family member. She had never been unkind exactly, but there had been a careful distance in all our interactions, a reminder that my presence disrupted the carefully constructed life she had built around the fiction that Richard's affair with my mother had never happened. The breakthrough in our relationship had come unexpectedly during the planning for the community center's second anniversary celebration. Catherine had been reviewing the guest list when she noticed that we had invited several elderly residents from a local assisted living facility, including some women she recognized as former colleagues of my mother's from the textile factory. Instead of objecting to their presence, as I had feared she might, Catherine had quietly asked if she could help coordinate transportation for the elderly guests and ensure that the venue was fully accessible for those with mobility limitations. That evening, I had watched Catherine moving gracefully through the crowd, making sure that every guest felt welcomed and valued, paying special attention to the former factory workers who seemed intimidated by the elegant surroundings. When one elderly woman mentioned that she had worked alongside Linda Collins and remembered her fondly, Catherine had listened intently, asking questions about my mother's personality and work ethic, with what seemed like genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Later that night, Catherine had approached me privately, her usually perfect composure slightly cracked with emotion. "Your mother sounds like she was an extraordinary woman," she had said quietly. I spent so many years resenting her, jealous of the love Richard felt for her, angry about the complications she represented in my life. But listening to her former colleagues tonight, hearing about her kindness and strength and dignity, I realized that I was wrong to see her as an enemy. She was just a woman trying to build a good life for herself and her daughter, and she deserved better than what circumstances gave her. That conversation had marked the beginning of a tentative but growing friendship between Catherine and me. She had begun to see me not as a threat to her family's stability, but as an opportunity to create something meaningful from a situation that had caused pain for everyone involved. Her social connections and understanding of philanthropic circles had proved invaluable as we worked to establish partnerships with other foundations and expand our community programs. The financial side of managing the inheritance had required a steep learning curve, but I had been determined to understand every aspect of the family's business interests rather than simply delegating responsibility to financial advisors. I had enrolled in executive education programs, studying everything from investment strategy to nonprofit management. The little girl who had struggled with math homework in a cramped apartment was now making decisions about multi-million-dollar investments and charitable giving strategies. Perhaps more importantly, I had insisted on maintaining transparency about how the foundation's money was being spent. Every program had clear goals and measurable outcomes, and we published annual reports that detailed both our successes and our failures. When a job training program wasn't producing the employment results we had hoped for, we didn't hide the disappointing statistics. Instead, we analyzed what had gone wrong, consulted with participants about how to improve the program, and made necessary adjustments. This approach had earned us credibility with community members who had been skeptical about whether wealthy outsiders could really understand and address local problems. The success of our programs had attracted attention from other communities and philanthropic organizations across the country. I had been invited to speak at conferences about innovative approaches to community development, and several other wealthy families had reached out asking for advice about how to use their resources more effectively for social good. A book deal had materialized, with a publisher interested in my story as an example of how inherited wealth could be transformed into a tool for social justice, rather than a perpetuation of inequality. But the recognition that meant the most to me came from unexpected sources. Last month, I had received a handwritten letter from Mrs. Rodriguez, whose son had participated in our coding boot camp and landed a job at a technology startup in Hartford. She wrote that the program had changed not just her son's life but her entire family's future, giving them hope and opportunities they had never imagined possible. She ended the letter by saying that she was sure my mother would be proud of what I had accomplished with the gifts I had been given. Reading that letter, I had thought about the conversation I might have had with my mother if she had lived to see these changes. I imagined telling her about the scholarship students graduating from college, about the former factory workers learning new skills, about the children playing in gardens that had once been accessible only to the wealthy elite. I wondered if she would be proud of the choices I had made, if she would see the community center and the foundation as worthy tributes to her memory and her struggles. Sometimes I still felt the weight of the roads not taken, the alternate life I might have lived if I had never discovered my connection to the Blackwood family. I thought about the woman I would have become if I had remained Emma Collins forever, working multiple jobs and struggling to make ends meet but building a life entirely through my own efforts. There was honor in that path, dignity in the independence my mother had chosen even when it meant accepting hardship. But I had come to understand that using inherited advantages to create opportunities for others was its own form of integrity. The wealth I had received was not something I had earned through my own merit, but the choices I made about how to use that wealth were entirely my own responsibility. I could have easily slipped into the comfortable isolation that wealth typically provides, surrounding myself with luxury and using my resources primarily for personal pleasure. Instead, I had chosen to see my inheritance as a tool for addressing the same systemic inequalities that had shaped my mother's struggles. The estate that had once felt like a symbol of everything I could never have had become something much more meaningful. A bridge between different worlds, a place where people from all backgrounds could access resources and opportunities that had traditionally been reserved for the privileged few. The girl who had felt like such an outsider when she first walked through these gates had discovered that her outsider perspective was exactly what was needed to transform the insider's world. Standing in the gardens on this warm summer evening, watching families from throughout Millbrook Valley enjoying the sunset, I felt a deep sense of contentment that had nothing to do with wealth or status. The true measure of belonging, I had learned, wasn't about fitting seamlessly into an existing community. It was about creating a community where everyone could belong, where the barriers that divided people could be transformed into bridges that connected them. The little office where I had first organized Richard's papers had been converted into a small museum displaying the history of both the Blackwood family and the textile factory, acknowledging both the privilege and the struggles that had shaped our community's past. Visitors could see photographs of elegant estate parties, alongside images of factory workers during their lunch breaks, creating a more complete picture of how different people had experienced life in Millbrook Valley across the decades. The most prominent display in the museum was a large photograph of my mother, taken during her brief happy period with Richard in 1983. She looked radiant and hopeful, her whole life stretched out ahead of her with infinite possibilities. Below the photograph was a quote from one of her former colleagues. Linda Collins believed that everyone deserved a chance to build something better, and she never let her own struggles make her bitter toward others. That belief, more than any financial inheritance, was the true legacy my mother had left me. The conviction that everyone deserved opportunities, that circumstances of birth shouldn't determine the limits of what was possible, that kindness and hard work could create positive change, even in the face of systemic inequalities. The Blackwood Community Foundation was successful not because we had money to solve problems, but because we had combined resources with genuine respect for the people we served, and a commitment to addressing root causes rather than just symptoms. As the evening grew darker and the families began to pack up their picnics and head home, I walked through the gardens one more time, appreciating the careful balance we had achieved between preservation and transformation. The formal structure of the original landscape remained, but it had been softened and made more welcoming, with meandering paths that invited exploration and gathering spaces that encouraged conversation between strangers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. We were planning to expand our programs to neighboring communities, and I had been invited to testify before the state legislature about policies that could make it easier for other communities to develop similar initiatives. The work of creating lasting change was never finished, never perfect, always requiring new adjustments and improvements. But tonight, walking through gardens that had once excluded people like my mother and me, surrounded by evidence of lives that had been changed for the better, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from discovering not just where you belong, but how you can help others belong as well. The outsider had become an insider, but more importantly, she had used that transformation to ensure that the definition of insider could expand, to include everyone who shared a commitment to building something better together. The estate that had once felt like a fortress protecting privilege had become a foundation supporting opportunity. The girl who had felt so out of place had found her place by creating space for others. And the legacy that had been built on exclusion was being transformed into something built on inclusion. One family, one scholarship, one program, one relationship at a time. 10 years later, I stood at the podium of the United Nations headquarters in New York City, looking out at delegates from around the world who had gathered to hear about innovative approaches to wealth redistribution and community development. The girl who had once been intimidated by a single wealthy estate was now addressing an international audience about how inherited privilege could be transformed into tools for global social justice. The Blackwood model, as it had come to be known in academic and philanthropic circles, had been replicated in 17 different communities across North America and Europe. Wealthy families who had traditionally used their resources primarily for personal benefit were discovering that opening their estates and businesses to community partnerships could create more meaningful legacies than any monument or museum. The ripple effects of our work in Millbrook Valley had grown into a movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between wealth and social responsibility. My presentation that day focused on the most recent development in our evolution, the establishment of the International Center for Community-Based Philanthropy, housed in a converted wing of Blackwood Estate. Representatives from foundations around the world came to Millbrook Valley for intensive training programs on how to implement community-driven charitable initiatives. The irony wasn't lost on me that the estate, which had once been a symbol of exclusivity, was now training ground for people committed to dismantling barriers between the wealthy and the communities they served. The success of these programs had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Earlier that year, I had received a call from the World Economic Forum, inviting me to participate in their annual meeting in Davos as part of a panel on reimagining inherited wealth. The conversation that followed had led to collaborations with development organizations working in countries where extreme wealth inequality created social instability. The principles we had developed in Millbrook Valley were being adapted for use in contexts ranging from urban slums in Latin America to rural villages in sub-Saharan Africa. But the work that remained closest to my heart was still happening in our own community. The scholarship program named for my mother had evolved into a comprehensive support system that followed students from high school through college and into their early careers. We had discovered that simply paying for education wasn't enough. Students from low-income backgrounds needed mentorship, networking opportunities, and sometimes basic life skills that middle-class families took for granted. The program now included everything from study abroad opportunities to internship placements to assistance with graduate school applications. Maria Santos, one of our first scholarship recipients, had graduated from MIT with a degree in environmental engineering and returned to Millbrook Valley to establish a clean energy consulting firm. Her company now employed 12 people and had contracts with municipalities throughout Connecticut to develop renewable energy infrastructure. Watching her present her business plan to potential investors in the same conference room where Richard had once made decisions about factory closures felt like witnessing the healing of historical wounds through practical action. The textile factory building had undergone another transformation, expanding beyond job training and business incubation to become a hub for research and development in sustainable manufacturing. A partnership with the State University had established a Center for Green Industrial Design, where students and established professionals worked together to develop manufacturing processes that could provide good jobs without environmental destruction. The building that had once represented extractive capitalism was becoming a laboratory for regenerative economic models. Richard, now 75, had stepped back from most business operations, but remained actively involved in the foundation's strategic planning. His health had declined somewhat over the past few years, a reality that had forced us to confront questions about succession and long-term sustainability that we had been avoiding. The conversations about who would inherit leadership of the foundation had been complex and sometimes painful, involving not just family members, but also community representatives and program participants who had become stakeholders in the foundation's future. Victoria had emerged as the most likely candidate to take over day-to-day operations, having completed a graduate degree in nonprofit management and demonstrated genuine commitment to the foundation's mission. Her transformation from privileged socialite to dedicated community organizer had been as dramatic as my own journey from struggling temp worker to philanthropic leader. She had spent 2 years living in a modest apartment in downtown Millbrook, working directly with program participants and learning about the challenges they faced in ways that no amount of theoretical education could have provided. James, surprisingly, had also found his place within the family's new mission, though his contribution was different from what anyone might have expected. After initially fighting the changes and attempting to distance himself from the foundation's work, he had gradually recognized that his business education and networking connections could be valuable assets for expanding our programs. He had become our primary liaison with corporate partners, using his insider knowledge of business culture to convince other companies to adopt more socially responsible practices. The relationship dynamics within the Blackwood family had stabilized into something that might not have resembled a traditional family structure, but functioned effectively as a team united around shared goals. Catherine had become one of the foundation's most effective fundraisers, using her social connections and understanding of wealthy donors to secure major gifts for program expansion. Her initial resistance to acknowledging my existence had evolved into what could only be described as maternal pride in my accomplishments and genuine affection for the person I had become. Richard and I had developed a close relationship that transcended the awkwardness of our unusual beginning. Our weekly coffee meetings had evolved into collaborative planning sessions, where we discussed everything from foundation strategy to family history, to his hopes for how the Blackwood legacy would be remembered. He had become not just the father I had never known, but also a mentor who helped me navigate the complexities of using wealth responsibly in a world where such wealth often corrupted its possessors. The personal costs of my transformation had been significant, though I rarely allowed myself to dwell on them. The demands of managing a large foundation and serving as a public figure in the philanthropic world had made it difficult to maintain normal relationships outside of work. I had ended a promising romantic relationship 2 years earlier when it became clear that my partner couldn't understand why I was willing to give away money that could have funded a lifetime of luxury and leisure. The isolation that came with wealth was real, even when that wealth was being used for altruistic purposes. But there had also been unexpected personal rewards. The community I had helped create around the foundation had become a chosen family of sorts, filled with people who shared my values and understood the importance of the work we were doing together. Former scholarship recipients stayed in touch, updating me on their careers and families and sometimes returning to serve as mentors for newer participants. Program graduates frequently stopped by the estate to share news of their successes and to express gratitude for opportunities that had changed their life trajectories. The most meaningful of these relationships was with Sandra Williams, a woman in her 50s who had participated in our job training program after being laid off from a manufacturing job. Sandra had initially been skeptical of the program, suspicious of what she saw as wealthy people trying to feel good about themselves by offering charity to the poor. Her blunt feedback during program evaluations had forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about the ways our initiatives sometimes felt patronizing to the people they were meant to serve. Sandra's critiques had led to fundamental changes in how we designed and implemented programs, shifting from a model where foundation staff made decisions about what communities needed to one where community members played central roles in identifying priorities and developing solutions. She had eventually joined our staff as Director of Community Engagement, bringing a perspective that ensured our programs remained grounded in the real experiences of the people they served, rather than the good intentions of their funders. The evolution of Sandra's role from skeptical participant to trusted colleague illustrated one of the most important lessons I had learned about philanthropic work: that the most effective way to help people was often to step back and create space for them to help themselves and each other. The Foundation's greatest successes had come not from programs where we provided services to passive recipients, but from initiatives where we provided resources and support for community-driven solutions to locally identified problems. This philosophy had guided our latest initiative, the Community Investment Fund, which provided small grants and loans to residents who wanted to start businesses, improve their homes, or develop neighborhood projects. Rather than requiring elaborate applications and extensive oversight, the fund operated on a peer review model where community members evaluated each other's proposals and provided ongoing support and accountability. The default rate was lower than traditional lending programs, and the social impact was higher because projects were designed by people who understood local needs and had personal stakes in their success. The fund had supported everything from a food truck operated by a recent immigrant to a community garden that provided fresh produce for low-income families, to a daycare center that allowed single mothers to pursue education and training opportunities. Each project created ripple effects throughout the community, demonstrating that economic development was most effective when it was organic and grassroots rather than imposed from outside. The success of these local initiatives had attracted attention from policymakers who were looking for alternatives to traditional welfare programs that often created dependency rather than empowerment. I had been invited to testify before congressional committees about the potential for community-based investment to address poverty more effectively than top-down government programs. The conversations had been challenging, requiring me to articulate complex ideas about social change to politicians who were often more interested in simple solutions and partisan talking points. But there had also been breakthrough moments when legislators from both parties recognized that our approach offered something that transcended traditional ideological divisions. Conservatives appreciated the emphasis on personal responsibility and local control, while progressives supported the focus on addressing systemic inequalities and empowering marginalized communities. The bipartisan interest had led to pilot programs in 3 other states, funded through a combination of government resources and private foundation grants. The international expansion of our work had brought different challenges and opportunities. Working with communities in developing countries had required us to confront the ways that American approaches to philanthropy could be culturally inappropriate or even harmful in different contexts. A partnership with organizations in Kenya had taught us that effective community development required deep understanding of local customs, power structures, and economic realities that couldn't be grasped through brief visits or theoretical study. The learning process had been humbling and sometimes frustrating, forcing me to acknowledge that good intentions and substantial resources weren't sufficient to create positive change in communities I didn't fully understand. The most successful international projects had been those where we primarily provided funding and technical support for initiatives designed and led by local organizations, rather than trying to export models that had worked in Connecticut to contexts where they might not be appropriate. These experiences had reinforced my conviction that effective philanthropy required genuine partnerships rather than charitable relationships, where all parties contributed expertise and resources, rather than some providing help to passive recipients. The foundation had evolved from an organization that did good work for people to one that did good work with people, and the difference had proved crucial to both the sustainability and the impact of our initiatives. The academic community had begun to take notice of our work as well, with researchers from universities around the world studying the Blackwood model as an example of innovative approaches to inherited wealth and social responsibility. A case study of our community development work had been included in business school curricula, and several doctoral dissertations had analyzed different aspects of our programs and their outcomes. The attention was gratifying but also somewhat uncomfortable, as it sometimes felt like we were being held up as exceptional, when what we were doing should simply be normal behavior for people with substantial resources. The real measure of our success wouldn't be the awards and recognition we received, but whether our example inspired other wealthy individuals and families to use their advantages more thoughtfully, and whether the communities we worked with became more prosperous and equitable as a result of our partnerships. The estate itself had continued to evolve, with new wings and facilities added to accommodate growing programs while preserving the historical character that made it special. The latest addition was a conference center designed specifically for hosting gatherings of community leaders, social entrepreneurs, and philanthropic innovators. The building used sustainable construction techniques and renewable energy systems, demonstrating that environmental responsibility and economic development could be complementary rather than competing priorities. Walking through the estate grounds in the early morning before the day's activities began, I often reflected on the journey that had brought me from desperate temp worker to international advocate for social change. The transformation had been profound and sometimes overwhelming, but it had also been deeply fulfilling in ways that traditional measures of success could never capture. The little girl who had worried about rent money and counted every dollar had grown into a woman who could influence policy discussions and fund life-changing opportunities for hundreds of people. But the core of who I was remained rooted in the lessons my mother had taught me about dignity, hard work, and treating everyone with respect regardless of their circumstances. The wealth and influence I had gained were tools for advancing those values, rather than replacements for them. The most important conversations I had were still with program participants who shared their stories and helped me understand how our work was really affecting their lives. Last week, I had received a letter from Miguel Rodriguez, whose family had been among the first to benefit from our housing improvement grants. His daughter was now in her senior year of college, preparing to become a teacher, and his son was participating in our coding boot camp, with plans to start his own software development business. Miguel wrote that the grant had allowed them to upgrade their home's electrical system and plumbing, making it safer and more comfortable, but more importantly, it had given his family hope that their circumstances could improve through their own efforts, combined with community support. Reading letters like Miguel's reminded me why the work mattered, and why it was worth the personal sacrifices and professional challenges that came with trying to use wealth responsibly in a world where such responsibility was rare. Every scholarship awarded, every business launched, every family stabilized, represented a small victory against the systemic inequalities that had shaped my mother's struggles and limited her opportunities. The foundation had also begun to address some of the structural issues that created and perpetuated poverty, working with local government and other organizations to advocate for policy changes that would make it easier for low-income families to build wealth and stability. We had supported campaigns for affordable housing development, living wage ordinances, and improved public transportation that connected low-income neighborhoods to job opportunities. This work was slower and often less visible than direct service programs, but it was essential for creating lasting change that didn't depend on the continued goodwill of individual philanthropists. The goal was to build systems that would continue to serve community needs, even if the foundation's resources were no longer available, ensuring that our impact would outlast any individual donor or organization. Standing in the gardens where my mother and Richard had once dreamed of a different future, surrounded by evidence of how those dreams had eventually been transformed into reality through persistence and collaboration, I felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with the end of projects or the achievement of goals. It was the satisfaction that comes from discovering your purpose and dedicating your life to pursuing it, regardless of the obstacles and setbacks along the way. The journey from outsider to insider to someone who redefined what those categories meant had taught me that belonging wasn't about fitting into existing structures, but about creating space where everyone could belong. The estate that had once excluded people like my mother had become a place where her values and dreams could flourish through the opportunities we provided to others facing similar challenges. The girl who had felt so out of place in this world of wealth and privilege had discovered that her outsider perspective was exactly what was needed to transform that world into something more inclusive and just. Sometimes the people who don't fit in are the ones best positioned to change what fitting in means, and sometimes the most powerful inheritance is not money or property, but the conviction that everyone deserves a chance to build something better. 20 years had passed when I received the phone call that would close the circle of my extraordinary journey. Dr. Patricia Chen, now the head of pediatric oncology at Connecticut Children's Medical Center, was calling to tell me about a young patient whose story would remind me why every choice I had made along the way had been worth it. Emma, there's a 7-year-old girl here named Isabella Martinez, Dr. Chen explained, her voice carrying the weight of both professional concern and personal hope. She's been battling leukemia for 8 months, and her family has been struggling not just with her medical care, but with the financial devastation that comes with childhood cancer. When I learned about their situation, I immediately thought of the foundation. I listened as Dr. Chen described Isabella's family. Her father worked 2 jobs, but had been forced to reduce his hours to help care for his daughter. Her mother had left her position as a teacher's aide to be with Isabella during treatments. They had health insurance, but the copays, travel expenses, and lost income had pushed them to the brink of bankruptcy. They were exactly the kind of family that our emergency assistance program had been designed to help. But there was something more to this story that Dr. Chen hadn't yet revealed. The thing is, Emma, Isabella's grandmother worked at the textile factory. Her name was Rosa Martinez, and she was one of the workers who stayed until the very end when the factory closed. When I mentioned the Blackwood Foundation to the family, Isabella's mother told me that her grandmother used to talk about a young woman named Linda Collins, who was always kind to the newer employees, who helped people navigate the workplace politics and stood up for workers when management was unfair. The connection hit me like a physical force. My mother had mentored Isabella's grandmother. The kindness and solidarity that my mother had shown to her fellow workers 3 decades ago was now creating an opportunity for me to help their descendant in her time of greatest need. The circular nature of this moment felt like the universe's way of affirming that our work was part of something larger than individual philanthropy or even systemic change. Within hours, I had arranged for the foundation to cover all of Isabella's medical expenses not handled by insurance, along with housing assistance for the family and a stipend to replace her parents' lost income. But more than the financial support, I felt compelled to meet this family personally, to understand how the threads of past and present had woven together in such a meaningful way. Isabella was a bright-eyed child whose spirit seemed undimmed by months of treatment. When I visited her in the hospital, she was working on a drawing that she explained showed her family's apartment building with a rainbow over it. "The rainbow means hope," she told me matter-of-factly, "because my mom says there's always hope, even when things are scary." Her grandmother Rosa, now in her 70s, sat beside Isabella's bed, her weathered hands holding a worn photograph that I recognized immediately. It was a group picture of textile factory workers from the early 1990s, and there in the center was my mother, her arm around a much younger Rosa, both women smiling despite the difficult circumstances they face daily. "Your mother saved my job once," Rosa told me, her voice soft with memory. "I had made a mistake with an order, something that could have gotten me fired. Linda noticed what happened before the supervisor did, and she stayed late that night to help me fix it. She said we had to look out for each other because nobody else would look out for us." Sitting in that hospital room, listening to Rosa's stories about my mother's generosity and leadership among the factory workers, I felt a profound sense of completion. The scared young woman who had walked through the gates of Blackwood Estate 20 years ago, feeling like she didn't belong anywhere, had discovered that she belonged everywhere. She belonged in the world of wealth and influence because she used that access to create opportunities for others. She belonged in the community of struggle because she remembered where she came from and why the work mattered. And she belonged in the continuum of care and solidarity that connected my mother's kindness to Rosa, to Isabella, to countless others who would benefit from the Foundation's work in years to come. Isabella recovered fully from her leukemia, and her family became active volunteers with the Foundation's family support programs. Her parents started a support group for other families facing childhood cancer, providing both practical assistance and emotional support to people navigating the complex medical and financial challenges that serious illness brings. Isabella herself, now in high school, had decided she wanted to become a doctor so she could help other sick children, and she was already participating in our pre-college preparation programs. The story of Isabella's family became a touchstone for me as I prepared to transition leadership of the Foundation to the next generation. Victoria had proved herself to be a capable and visionary leader, and she would officially take over as executive director on the Foundation's 20th anniversary. My role would shift to that of board chair and senior advisor, allowing me to focus on writing and speaking about the lessons we had learned while ensuring that the Foundation's work would continue beyond my direct involvement. The transition felt natural and appropriate. The little girl who had grown up in poverty had become a woman who could influence global conversations about wealth and justice. But the most important work had always been about creating systems and relationships that would outlast any individual leader. The Foundation was now strong enough and deeply enough rooted in community partnerships to thrive, regardless of who held the title of executive director. On the evening of the Foundation's 20th anniversary celebration, held in the gardens where I had first felt like such an outsider, I stood before a crowd of nearly 1,000 people whose lives had been touched by our work over the years. Scholarship recipients who had become doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs, and community leaders filled the audience alongside their families, their mentors, and the staff members who had supported their journeys. I thought about my mother as I looked out at these faces, imagining how proud she would be to see the ripple effects of the values she had instilled in me. The woman who had worked so hard for so little had become the inspiration for programs that had changed hundreds of lives and influenced approaches to philanthropy around the world. Her legacy lived not in monuments or endowments, but in the opportunities that continued to multiply through the lives of people she would never meet, but whose futures had been shaped by her daughter's determination to honor her memory through action. The estate that had once represented everything I could never have had become the launching pad for everything I was meant to give. The feeling of being an outsider had transformed into the knowledge that true belonging comes not from fitting into existing structures, but from creating new structures where everyone can fit. And the girl who had walked through those imposing gates 20 years ago, clutching a worn resume and hoping for just enough work to pay her bills, had discovered that sometimes the most important journeys begin with feeling like you don't belong and end with helping everyone else find their place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.